For this religion of Islam to have reached us after all these centuries, many people who came before us suffered in unimaginable ways. Some of them were thrown out of their homes, some of them murdered, some of them tortured. In the Common Era, 622, 2 men fled their homes, fled the only homes they'd ever known, and took refuge in a cave in a mountain behind their house or behind their town. These 2 men were the noblest of all creation, Muhammad ibn Abdullah alayhi afdal salatu wassalam, and his friend Abu Bakr radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. For 3 nights they slept in a cave, afraid for their lives, as their enemies put a bounty on their heads, and the soldiers of their enemy were searching the deserts and the mountains looking for them. For 3 nights, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam at the age of 53 and his friend Abu Bakr at the age of 51 slept in that cave. Then finally, they left the cave heading in the opposite direction of Medina, heading away from Medina, for fear that traveling the normal road would have got them caught immediately. The enemies of Islam had put 100 camels bounty on the head of our noble messenger. In Mecca, there was a man called Suraqah ibn Malik. He was a knight, a fighter, a warrior, and a hunter. He heard some people talking about having seen some camels traveling in a direction away from Medina. He said to the people around him, I knew that was the Prophet and his companion. Or he said to himself later on, he said, I knew that was the Prophet and his companion, but I feared, or I did not want to share the bounty with anyone. So I said to my companions that this must be my neighbors who have lost one of their camels. They're out looking for it. And then he said, and this hadith is in Sahihain, in Bukhari and Muslim. He went home, took his weapons, got his horse, and chased in the direction that he heard there were some travelers. He followed, coming closer and closer to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He could hear the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's voice reciting something that he could not understand. And Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was turning round and looking at him, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was not turning round. When he came close enough to hear some of the words of the Prophet, his horse's feet got stuck in the sand and he was thrown off his horse. He got up, climbed on his horse again, and he said, at this time in my life I was a young man, a strong man, and I'd never been thrown. So he climbed on his horse again, he chased, until he came close enough to hear what the Prophet ﷺ was reciting. And then he was thrown again. When he got up the second time now, he said, I knew there would come a day where the Prophet ﷺ was victorious. So I chased after them until I could hear what the Prophet ﷺ was reciting. And I called out to him and I said, Oh Muhammad, tell me what you're saying. And the Prophet ﷺ turned around for the first time and he said, go back to Makkah and tell nobody what you have seen. Imam Bayhaqi and Ibn Abdul Barr carry on the story, and they say, Suraqah ibn Malik said to the Prophet ﷺ, I will do that for you, but what will you do for me? And the Prophet ﷺ said to him, go back and I will give you the crown and the bangles of the Emperor of Persia. Subhanallah. A man alone, a refugee, fleeing from his home, with no weapons, no army, no power, nothing in this dunya did the Prophet ﷺ have to his name at this point. And he said to this man, I will give you the crown of the Emperor of possibly the greatest of empires to have ever existed. The crown of the King of Kings, Shah Jahan. Suraqah ibn Malik went back to his home. The Prophet ﷺ immigrated to Medina, where he was welcomed by the people and treated as a leader, if not a king. 10 years later, the Prophet ﷺ died. 2 years after that, Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu died. Umar radiallahu anhu became the Khalifa, and the armies of the Muslims entered Ctesiphon, the capital of the Persians. The great jewels of the Persian empress, that had been worn by them for centuries fell into the hands of desert dwellers of Arabia, who entered the palaces of this King of Kings, not having reached their level in technology, nor their level in literacy or poetry or advancement. They entered ruling over these people with the words La ilaha illallah. They entered the palace of this great king, the palace of the kings of Persia who had ruled it for centuries. There was a carpet that for centuries had been sat on by the emperors of Persia. It was made out of silk and gold and pearls. It resembled a garden. And they wrote to Khalifa Umar and they said, what shall we do with this great treasure we have found? Umar radiallahu anhu said, cut it up and distribute it equally among the soldiers of the Muslims. They sent the crown and the bracelets of the emperor to Umar. He had no need for those things. He was not to become a king. He was not to copy the ways of the disbelievers. He took the crown and the bracelets and he called out, where is Sadaqah ibn Malik? The Prophet ﷺ died without having been able to pay you the debt he owed you. And a poor man from Makkah, a hunter, a warrior, now had the crown and the bracelets of the Emperor of Persia. However hard the dunya seems at a certain point, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised, Inna ba'd al-usri yusr. Indeed, after hardship will come ease. However poor and hungry and difficult we may find life today, it does not mean that we will not be powerful and great and rich in the future. And whether that happens in this life or the next, it means nothing. Because power or power and wealth in this life is not any sign of Allah's pleasure. On the day of judgment, سَيَعْلَمُونَ مَنْ أَضْعَفُ نَاصِرًا وَأَقَلُّ عَدَدًا سَيَعْلَمُونَ مَنْ أَضْعَفُ نَاصِرًا وَأَقَلُّ عَدَدًا. On that day, the disbelievers will know who has the weakest helper and who has the least of soldiers, or who is the weakest. On that day, the great kings, the powerful enemies of Allah, will be brought down to nothing. And they will say, Ya laytani kuntu turaba. They will wish that they were dust. On that day, the Muslim, however much he suffered in this life, if he died upon Tawheed, he will be rewarded with everlasting paradise. Allahumma allimna ma yanfa'na wanfa'na bima 'allamtana. Allahumma salli wa sallim ala nabiyyina Muhammad.